I thought I would begin with a kind of a personal story about my own attraction to Dietrich von Hildebrand and where that arose. And perhaps I'll pick up the story in my graduate student days where I was, I guess, very interested in several segments of phenomenology, but particularly the Heideggerian and Gadamerhian tradition that was the tradition I was mainly exposed to as an undergraduate. My undergraduate work was heavily in the area of classical philosophy. I was a classical language major, you might say, in a program that was unique in many respects. And part of my attraction to Heidegger was his attempts to incorporate elements of the classical tradition, both Heraclitus on the one hand and Aristotle on the other, into his own methodological approach to the question of being. And I became very dissatisfied with Heidegger. I was studying with someone who had taken a seminar of his at Heidelberg and had also done some work with him in another place. And this professor had a kind of devotion to Heidegger that was impervious to critical dialogue, and that was one of the reasons that really troubled me about extended work on Heidegger in my graduate student days. And I also found that I had adopted certain ways of thinking about philosophical questions that imprisoned me, so to speak. So I found that I was making arguments that one could not really grasp things as they are in their nature, that one needed to, every time one took up an epistemological question, one needed to do so from a critical perspective, that is to say, a Kantian perspective. And I lost hope in engaging in serious philosophical dialogue for a period of time, and I was taking out applications to a number of other places. An earlier idea of mine was to go to law school. That was my plan, and so I was already collecting applications to law schools, and I was also collecting applications to PhD programs in classics, and where I was studying had an excellent program as well, but I really wanted to go to Cornell, so that was my plan to transfer there. And I thought I would just maintain the tradition. There was really no new philosophy to be done. So that's a sort of exaggerated position, right? You could see I had some hubris, thinking that if I couldn't solve fundamental questions, then philosophy is over for me or something. But I had a friend, I still have this friend, his name's Neil Mussett. He was a graduate of Franciscan University and studied, I think, with Dr. Crosby as well as several of my colleagues now. And we were talking one day and he said, look, it's not the case that the whole phenomenological tradition is condensed in the works of Heidegger and Gadamer, right? And I had worked through some of the works of Husserl, but they were mainly the later Husserl. So he put me on the path that led me to reading Dietrich von Hildebrand's philosophy, and I was transformed by it. So I regained my initial love for philosophy and found that I had a way to sort of break out of the Kantian prison that I felt entrapped by, and was I guess re-energized in my philosophical quest. So I'm very grateful to Dietrich von Hildebrand and his students for that, and retain many of the insights of Dietrich von Hildebrand. So as I was thinking this morning about how to cast this, the idea of some kind of marriage counselor came to mind. I don't know, I don't have any direct experience, but at least the popular presentations of marriage counseling that I've encountered and conversations I've had with friends who've been in some difficulties make it clear that there's value in sort of exposing points of hurt, so to speak, in the relationship, and so I want to do that first and foremost here. So I have a general thesis and then a specific thesis, and one more point by way of introduction. And you can see this in the general thesis, or the way I'm trying to characterize this, and that is perhaps a McIntyrean point. Like Dr. Crosby, I want to have a McIntyrean point of entry here, and MacIntyre's had a great influence on my own thought, particularly in the last 7 or 8 years. And one thing that strikes me about von Hildebrand is he's often presented or regarded, depending on whether one is looking at it an adherent or an opponent of his approach, as a sui generis, right? So yes, he comes from the realist phenomenological tradition, but other practitioners of that very tradition found reasons to think of von Hildebrand as doing something other than what they were doing. And many in the Catholic intellectual tradition wanted to embrace von Hildebrand for some of his insights and his criticisms of developments in modernism or developments in the church, and yet von Hildebrand doesn't fit neatly and nicely into aspects of that tradition. And yet I think for von Hildebrand to have staying power, so to speak, he needs to be incorporated into the main stream of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Not that that tradition is reducible to the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. I know there are many currents running into this stream, but nevertheless, one has to wrestle with that tradition, and there's a way to stretch it, to expand it in the way that I think MacIntyre has fruitfully done in order to show how a thinker such as Dietrich von Hildebrand can be thought of as a member of that tradition, even if a distant one. So the general thesis, more than just recognizing there are points of resonance between the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition and Dietrich von Hildebrand, I wish to suggest that the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition provides the means by which von Hildebrand's unique contributions can be defended and extended. And I'll have a specific thesis on the backside here. But here are at least some of the reasons why the complementarity that's possible between the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition and von Hildebrand have been overlooked and obscured. So one is that practitioners or adherents of the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition have been resistant to the suggestions that somebody not from that tradition could really make genuinely new contributions. And I want to be clear, I've said it already, but I think that Dietrich von Hildebrand does. Okay? He's an original thinker. I think he provides valuable insights that we need to incorporate into the mainstream of our intellectual tradition. And so I've experienced, because I float between these two camps, so to speak. Just last week I was at a conference, and a surprisingly off-colored joke was told. I won't tell the joke. I think it's inappropriate. But I was surprised by it. That's why I was witness to it. Otherwise, I would have not been there. But the punchline was basically that the married couples who engage in the marital embrace must necessarily do so with a bad conscience because it's so subjectively satisfying, right? So you can conjure all kinds of jokes on the basis of that. But this came from an Aristotelian Thomist, a noted theologian who I respect in many respects, and but it's a way to alienate the von Hildebrandians, right? They're peculiar. They don't have any appreciation for our embodied experience. They talk about things that are natural and good as though they're somehow bad because they're merely subjectively satisfying. And there wasn't a serious recognition of the kinds of distinctions we discussed yesterday that were a part of this discussion, even though I tried to say a few things, but it was not the right context for laying those out. So that's problematic, and it's also the case that some von Hildebrandians who've experienced this kind of alienation, marginalization by Thomists in particular, have developed their own walls, their own ways of sometimes not listening to the Aristotelian Thomistic side. And this is, I think, deeply problematic, and it's that which I want to address, and that which I think, for instance, one of my own intellectual and moral heroes, John Paul II, has addressed quite well in his thought. So the second point, here are the wounds that I was talking about when I said I would have to touch a few wounds. Here are a few points that I think are difficult for an Aristotelian Thomist, and there are some others, but these are the main ones that come to light. So in my interpretation, some of the interpretations that Dietrich von Hildebrand has given, or characterizations that he has given of Aristotle or Aquinas in their particular positions, are reductionistic. They're I don't want to say unfair. I don't think he was intentionally dishonest in any way, shape, or form, but incomplete, of the sort that one could take a passage or a way in which, say, Aquinas characterizes something and take that for the whole of the theory. And so here are 4 points at which I think that happens. And this was the first one that really hit me. I was inspired by von Hildebrand's work, What is Philosophy? And in there he attempts a rapprochement with the Aristotelian tradition and points out that it was great that Aristotle recognizes there are a couple of first principles. But it's too bad that he didn't realize there were so many first principles, right? So Aristotle was on to something, but he just has the principle of non-contradiction and a few others. But that's to take an axiom as a principle, I realized. Okay, so Aristotle thinks that there are as many first principles as there are beings, right? So in Book 2, Chapter 19 of the Posterior Analytics, when he's describing how it is that nous comes to apprehend the very nature of those beings that it apprehends, those are each of them archai. Okay, they're each of them first principles, starting points. And axioms, on the other hand, are relatively few, and there are several versions of the principle of non-contradiction that Aristotle provides in his metaphysics. But it's not just von Hildebrand who thinks that about Aristotle. I know other people who thought this about Aristotle, but Aristotle, I think, has a far more expansive view of first principles and our ability to apprehend them in their essence structure. In fact, this summer I've been working through the metaphysics with several graduate students, and we've been focusing on those passages where it's really clear that Aristotle has a way of accounting for how we can grasp things as they are in themselves, and do so insofar as their first principles. A second area, and this has been much discussed, I don't need to say too much about this, but I think the way in which von Hildebrand characterizes the tradition that you find in running from Augustine through Aquinas, Bonaventure, all the way up to really his own time in the Catholic intellectual tradition, the privation theory of evil, as a theory that characterizes evil as a mere privation, and such that the inference is often made that there's no way to describe an action as specifically evil. And that is, I think, a mischaracterization. Okay? So in one of the passages that I had you read for today, question 18 of the Prima Secundae, Aquinas makes the case that, in fact, actions are specifically evil. And they're specifically evil in a variety of ways. So actions indeed are evil, and we can speak of individuals as evil. But indeed many beings are evil, but we wouldn't want to say that evil is a being in any way, shape, or form. And if we were, we'd have to say either that God is not all good because God created everything, and if some things that are evil, then God must not be all good because evil came forth from him. Or you have to say that some other being is a creator ex nihilo, to be able to bring forth from nothing a new kind of being. So if human beings or angels are the source of beings that are in and of themselves evil, then they had to bring them forth from nothing if you're going to say that God is all good. So this is the way the tradition wrestles with this question from a grand cosmological and metaphysical point of view. And yet I do think there are insights into the nature of evil that von Hildebrand provides, just as there are insights into the nature of a priori essence structures when he discusses first principles. So I'll get to that in a second. The way of describing the Thomistic position on the good as the merely appetible, right? So you saw in question 5 of the prima pars of the Summa Theologiae that indeed Aquinas says that what good adds to being is the notion of appetibility, but that doesn't mean that that's the whole of his doctrine on the good, okay? In fact, he has far more to say about the good, but this is what the good means in a proper sense. But every being, insofar as it is good. And there's a cosmic level in which the good is regarded as ordered, all things ordered towards God's glory. So on both the individual substantial level as well as on the cosmic level, I think that one could expand the way in which the good is characterized and described within the Thomistic tradition. And then finally, another point of difficulty here, I think, in interpretation is and this comes in part from the critique of eudaimonism, but also just thinking about the subject, the individual. Human flourishing is flourishing qua the individual. And I think that often it's overlooked by von Hildebrand how relational the Aristotelian and particularly the Thomistic accounts of human beings is. And so to be is to be in relation to other persons. One can only really flourish in relation to other persons. And some of this comes out in Aristotle's discussion of friendship. More comes out, I would say, in question 23 of the Secunda Secundae of the Summa Theologiae, where it's very clear for Aquinas the goal of human life is friendship with God, right? And that kind of communion with the divine being is made possible through the incarnation. But that's happiness. It's not happiness for me. It's not flourishing for me. It's always in union with others. And this has profound implications for the way we think about political philosophy as well. And in fact, I tend to agree with MacIntyre's claim that he makes at the end of that chapter 5 that you saw from After Virtue, that strictly speaking, there is no such thing as an individual in the way that the individual is described. It's a creation of the 17th century, right? That doesn't mean there aren't biological, there aren't substantial individuals. In fact, I think individuality and incommunicability is a feature of every being insofar as it is. So I'm not denying that, okay? But the idea that an individual, that a human being is, qua human being, an individual and not a dependent rational animal, to use MacIntyre's phrase, is deeply problematic, I think. So that's something that I think von Hildebrand can appreciate, but when he's describing the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, he tends to treat the account of flourishing as flourishing for the individual, and doesn't see some of these other layers. So here's another controversial claim. Phenomenology as a method is analytical. Philosophy, on the other hand, is both analytical and synthetic. Every phenomenology yearns for a metaphysics. Nearly every phenomenologist provides some sort of metaphysics, but often with a bad conscience, and so not systematically. Okay? That is to say, if we're going to take phenomenology purely as a methodology, and here I'm following John Paul II's way of thinking about phenomenology in some respects, it's an attunement to the given, right? This is the way we talked about von Hildebrand's phenomenology yesterday in the first session, right? An attunement to the given. We listen to beings as they present themselves, and that's the genius of von Hildebrand. That's what excited me when I encountered his writings. I found myself attuning to the given in ways that I had not in some time, and it opened up new vistas for exploration. But how do you pull it all together, right? Is that something that a phenomenologist, qua phenomenologist, does? Well, strictly speaking, no. Right? If you take the methodology as attunement to the given, when do you ask the question, how does it all hang together? Right? When do you pursue an investigation of the being qua being, such that would lead you to connect all of the insights into the given that one has gone through. We need to do that, right? Every philosopher does that. Von Hildebrand does that, and maybe bad conscience is that's truly an exaggeration. But what I mean by that is that when a phenomenologist is asking those sorts of questions, it's sort of outside of the realm of the phenomenological method, right? And so why are there so many varieties of phenomenology? Because phenomenology is waiting to be combined with some kind of synthesis, right? This attunement to the given that Husserl engaged in, or that von Hildebrand engaged in, needs to be tied together in a comprehensive fashion, right? So if you look at Herbert Spiegelberg's History of the Phenomenological Movement, right, he went through, I think, 3 editions. Each edition was massively larger than the one before, and there were so many types of phenomenology, precisely because phenomenology, qua phenomenology, I think, is a kind of analytic methodology. And that opens up vistas for exploration and connections with some elements of the analytic tradition, I think, that have been overlooked and could be fruitful. But still, it leaves the door open for all kinds of metaphysical explorations. And so John Paul II is explicit about this. He says that he needs to turn to the Thomistic tradition in order to ground his phenomenological analysis. And I know that this is not a position that is necessarily endorsed by all of my colleagues. And so I certainly don't mean to cause any offense here, but I'm trying to be faithful to the way in which phenomenologists describe what they are doing, and it's not the whole of philosophy, I think. Right? One needs to work with a system. So when Dietrich von Hildebrand makes metaphysical points, they're, I would say, generally Platonic and specifically Augustinian in many places, and rather eclectic in others. He's combining different elements, but there's not a raising to a systematic level the question of being. So this seminar is called The Philosophy of Value. Would it be different if it was called The Ontology of Value, if we were looking at value from within the science of being qua being? I think it would. So what do I mean by metaphysics? Here I just have listed some of the labels that Aristotle uses for metaphysics. Of course, the one he never uses is metaphysics. But he calls it wisdom, he calls it philosophy, he calls it first philosophy, I didn't add that. He calls it the science of first causes and principles. In Little Alpha, or Book Beta, he calls it the science of truth. So it's an aletheology. It's in Gamma, or Book 4, that he articulates it as a science of being qua being. And he describes it as the science of God. So this is Alpha, Chapter 2, in 2 ways, right? One, insofar as we reflect upon God as the cause of the order of the whole, and secondly, insofar as we seek to have God's wisdom, right? And I think that there's a point of deification in the Aristotelian approach to metaphysics that I want to draw out a little bit more today. And that's a point of deep resonance, I think, with the von Hildebrandian position. Okay, so now to a specific thesis. Now that I've said all of these controversial things, what can we say about value? So here's my specific thesis. Dietrich von Hildebrand makes many outstanding and original insights into value. However, his own resistance to a systematic inquiry into being qua being leaves the work of developing an ontology of value incomplete. The Aristotelian Thomistic tradition can strengthen Dietrich von Hildebrand's treatment of value by incorporating it into a systematic science of being qua being. So here are several points to remember. Right, so what are values described metaphysically? What are these things? Okay, I don't want to say they're mere relations. I don't want to say that they're independent beings either. Right, they're not substances. Von Hildebrand is explicit that they're born by beings. So there really are values. I think they're not substances. They are, strictly speaking, accidents. That is to say, they inhere in substances. And I'm not claiming that every accident is a value either. There are all kinds of accidents that aren't values. And secondly, I want to emphasize that accidents are not unimportant, right? So Aristotle famously develops his fourfold approach to being when he says that being is said in many senses. One of those senses of being is being in the sense of the accidents, right? There's also being in the categorical sense, so the figures of predication, substance, and accidents. There's being in the sense of potency and act, and there's being in the sense of truth and falsity. And he calls being in the sense of truth the kuriotata, the most lordly sense of being. That's in Theta 10 of the Metaphysics. And he argues that we can investigate each of these senses of being according to an attended focus upon ousia, or substance, right? And that launches him into the heart of the metaphysics. But he quickly dispenses with accidental being. He says that we cannot have a science of accidents qua accidents, precisely because they're accidental, right? So there's not a science of how it is that a particular woman is particularly noble in her actions, right? There's not a science of that. There's a science of nobility, yes. There's a science of what it is to be a man or a woman. There's a science we call ethics, but there's not a science of how this particular woman came to embody the value of nobility, okay? So there's no scientific treatment of accidents per se, but that doesn't mean that they're unimportant. In fact, our lives are encased within the accidental. We're born to a particular family, we're raised in a particular city, in a particular faith culture, go to these particular schools, and so on and so forth. In fact, the narrative unity of our whole life is a sequence of accidental occurrences, not in the sense of chance, okay? Accidental in the sense of it didn't have to be this way, right? So there's no science of how Sanford came to be the man he is because he was born in a particular city and so on and so forth, right? There's not a science of that. There is a science of moral education. Again, there is a science of good parenting. There is a science of what it is to be a human being. So what I'm emphasizing here is even though in the Aristotelian tradition one doesn't have a science of accidents qua accidental, one can still have a science of accidents qua inhering in substances, or as they are in and of themselves. And certainly there's a science of value that one can pursue, a science of values, I mean, right, in the philosophical sense of a science. Values are knowable, which is to say they're separable in thought, and so they represent a certain independence from the substance to which they belong and can be responded to as such. So I think there's a way to think of values as accidents of substances that indeed enable one to grasp them as such. They present themselves with a kind of independence from the substances in which they inhere. And that does not, however, make them independent beings. It doesn't make them primary substances, and we don't want to say that they're secondary substances either, right? Because every value, as it is in embodied experience, is a value of a particular individual. It's an individual value. Now, we can grasp the nature of a value on the universal level, but I wouldn't want to say that the values in which, or of which the world is composed, if we're going to use that idea that Dr. Crosby developed yesterday of a world of values, I don't want to say that the values in the world are themselves universals, right? Everything that is individual. Everything that is, insofar as it is also incommunicable, but it's separable in thought, in the way that we separate out in thought that which is in its individuality is by constructing a secondary substance of that thing. But again, the values that are embedded in the world are each individual values, I want to argue. And so the last point here, beware the epistemic ontic fallacy. that's the way my logic professor in graduate school described the very common human tendency to think that beings are in the way that we apprehend them to be, right? So because we apprehend values as universals, we want to say that values are universals, right? And that gives us a kind of one-to-one command of our knowledge over the thing, and there's a real desire to have that kind of correspondence, the correspondence that's characteristic of, in many respects, the Platonic tradition. But I don't think that's the kind of correspondence we actually have. I certainly am a realist. I think that we grasp things universally, but the things that we grasp are individuals, and that goes for values as well. So we can talk about values on the universal level. We can define them more completely. We can talk about the ways in which we respond to them or ought to respond to them, but we nevertheless need to acknowledge that they really are in the world as the individual values that are part and parcel of the beings they inhere in. Okay? And so I thought I would open this up for comment. I've said a lot of I know things that are somewhat controversial and maybe inaccurate, but I thought I would do you the service of laying out my own perspective on how the dialogue needs to begin and where some of the points of division have been and where the points of unification might arise through additional development. I was looking at virtue, value, and the human person, and arguing that the Aristotelian tradition, Aristotle in particular, supplies some metaphysical foundation to the Schillerian account of the person at some points of difficulty in his own descriptions, but there's a far richer exploration of the inner life of the person that Schiller and von Hildebrand provide than you find in the Aristotelian tradition. So that's just by way of an example of some of what I've been thinking about for a while, right? So there are indeed some gaps in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition that can be filled in. That is, there's a kind of skeletal structure that's provided that can be fleshed out in rich and important and necessary ways by the insights of von Hildebrand and other phenomenologists. So I'm not always sure what Hildebrand means when he talks about being, right? So he talks about values as beings, and that makes me think, well, what kind of being are we talking about here? And they certainly are beings of our focused experience, right? So we can train our phenomenological lens upon values, and they present themselves to us in, to use the Husserlian jargon of the epoche, right? So we've bracketed everything out except the value. We're focusing upon the eidetic structure of the value. That certainly makes it seem like it's independent and is its own being, right? And it can be described as such. And so part of the, or one of the hurdles, let's say, of the attempt to combine the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition with this way of thinking about value is now we've got these independent entities that have a kind of status that's indifferent with respect to existence, right? They really are, but they are in a way that they can be or cannot be, right? So we have a realm of value that can be described separate from any kind of actual beings. And what I think that realm is so to back up a little bit, I think the way that von Hildebrand sometimes talks about values in that realm, in that way, in and of themselves, it's like a different dimension of reality. Okay, But I want to deny that there is that dimension of reality. I want to say there are common natures. I want to say that you can regard things from an absolute perspective. And so if we're going to talk about the nature of anything, right, there's the nature in the thing. There's the nature understood in the mind. That's short version, that's the universal, okay, the secondary substance that you've constructed on the basis of the thing. And then there's the nature of the thing absolutely considered. Okay, so there's the nature absolutely considered of human beings, right? Each one of us is an individual human being. Each one of us has an idea of what it is to be a human being. That's our universal. But there's also this idea that it's true to say that each one of us is a human being. Okay? That's sometimes called the common nature. And Scotus makes much of that. And Scotus sometimes treats that as really existing, although he'll deny in other places that it really exists. And something similar happens, I think, with von Hildebrand in the way he talks about value. Right? But so I want to put some of the treatments of value into the way in which one can talk about a common nature, but that's always got to be grounded in the individual things. There isn't this realm that exists. If you're going to take seriously the notion of indifferent with respect to existence, it doesn't exist anywhere. Okay? It isn't in the way that we want to say that things typically are.